The world's richest man, Jeff Bezos, whose net worth is $130 billion, is offering to give $10 billion to any scientists, activists, and non-governmental organizations, or any effort that offers a real possibility to help fix the climate crisis, and he's calling this initiative the Bezos Earth Fund. As of today, we have no idea how this money is going to be spent, where it's going to go, or if Bezos is actually going to stick to his plan of giving this money. But loads of people are calling this the climate miracle, the thing that is going to help propel us to fix the climate crisis. But as I'm going to go into in this video, I think that this initiative could actually do so much more harm than good. Why? Because it gives the impression that the climate crisis can be fixed through individuals and donations and billionaires, and that there's going to be a billionaire superhero that's going to come and save the day, and at the same time the root causes of the problem are kept intact, unchallenged and unexamined. In all likelihood, this is just another corporate scheme like the ones we've seen over and over again, where corporations donate large amounts of money in order to maintain their reputations and distract attention from all their hideous labour practices and their carbon footprints, all the while maximising their profits. At the same time, it keeps non-governmental organisations, individuals, activists from challenging these corporations because they're so dependent on their funding that it completely blunts any kind of radical political or systemic analysis or resistance. I think it's important to look at where this type of wealth accumulation comes from and the root causes of the climate crisis. But first, in order to be able to understand the ethics of what Bezos is doing and whether or not it could help the climate crisis, I think it's first important to look at where this type of wealth accumulation originates from and the root causes of climate change. So the root cause of this type of wealth accumulation and of climate change is the capitalist economic system. Capitalism is an economic system where the maximization of private profit lies at its core. In other words, owners must get their workers to work for significantly less than their work is actually worth in order for them to make a profit. The wealth that capitalists such as Jeff Bezos have should have been given to all of his workers because they are the ones that are actually doing the work. He didn't earn any of this money, he took it from the labour that other people did for him. The super rich who have all the power in this world want us all to believe that this is just and that they earn all of their wealth so that we accept the system as it is. But there's nothing just about any of this wealth accumulation. It's based off of the exploitation and the robbery of millions of people. I mean, Bezos has enough money to give all of his 674,000 workers £250,000 and still be a billionaire. You don't get a say into how your company is run, you just do as you're told. If you don't do as you're told, you lose your job. For most people, these type of jobs aren't meaningful or rewarding. It simply kills your spirit. There's no freedom in any of this. And you'll do this for half of your waking hours, spend hours commuting, feeling exhausted. You don't have time to spend with your family and friends so that a rich person can get wealthier and wealthier. If you don't do this, you won't have enough money to survive. Is there really any wonder that the Gallup poll found that 85% of people across the globe hate their jobs? And everyone is always saying, well, this is justified because the owners took the initiative, took the risk to set up the company in the first place. But would it be ethical to exploit child workers because someone took the risk or initiative to set it up? And what about slavery? This used to be completely justified, yet now most of us agree that this is completely wrong. So why does taking the initial gamble justify doing horrific, exploitative things? So how does climate change come into all of this? Well, a lot of people are always arguing that environmental destruction and the exploitation of workers isn't inherent to the capitalist system because capitalists or owners can act in socially just or in equitable ways. However, competition forces even the most socially conscious capitalists to act in inherently unjust and environmentally destructive ways, because if they don't, another firm will, and they'll be pushed out of the market and go bankrupt and not be able to continue their practices at all. So in order to avoid being taken over by competition and remain stable under capitalism, companies have to keep producing more and more in order to maintain economic growth and accumulate profit. So capitalism is based off of the endless pursuit of profit, which requires endless growth. Endless growth is inherently unsustainable because it requires the continuous extraction of raw materials, turning them into commodities, and distributing them across the globe. This usually relies on fossil fuel energy, the mass disposal of waste, and even engaging in conflicts or wars to gain access to natural resources, markets, or cheap labour, contributing to climate change on a large scale. There can't be infinite growth on a finite planet. At some point, there won't be any more resources to be able to extract in order to continue producing goods. There is no consideration for the long-term well-being of people or the planet because profits are organized around short-term horizons, even if it means causing irreparable damage to the world's ecosystem. It is estimated that in the coming decades, 2/3 of humanity will not have the ecological space for survival, neither land nor water nor biodiversity, because all of it is being transformed into private property and commodity. As we all know, the poorest people across the globe are going to shoulder the worst effects of climate change, propelling them into yet more poverty, inequality, and suffering as they are forced to deal with the ramifications of climate disaster. To remain competitive and not be pushed out of the market, they also have to push down the prices of the commodities that they're selling. But in order to push down the prices of commodities, they also necessarily need to push down the prices of wages in order to continue making a profit. So companies are forced to continuously cut costs and choose cheaper and cheaper labour, which generally means the most inhumane ones, where people are forced to work for the least amount of money in the worst type of conditions. Competition doesn't just occur within nations, it occurs on a mass world scale, driving the formation of a larger and larger class of poor and unemployed workers from which corporations can pick and choose. This has led to a global system where colonized nations are essentially produced as global sweatshops for the West, kept in an underclass state, making just a few dollars a day. If workers start to organize or demand better conditions, capitalists can simply replace them with other workers or move their corporation to another country or area where there are more favorable conditions for doing business. So essentially, none of these workers really have any choice but to continue to engage in this type of work, because if they don't, they'll be unemployed and may not be able to feed themselves or their families. And none of the disturbing scandals that we hear about of the conditions that workers are kept under lead to any meaningful change, because capitalists use subcontractors so they can say they weren't directly involved, they had absolutely no idea, and it helps them get away with extreme forms of exploitation and suffering. The need to put a downward pressure on costs also incentivizes capitalists to invest in labor-saving technology to gain competitive advantage. Some people even estimate that 50% of our jobs will be taken over by automation by 2050. So 50% of us might have to exist in a state of unemployment and poverty. Perhaps even worse, capitalism needs a significant level of the population to be living in poverty and unemployment. This is called the so-called reserve army of labour, which is kept barely alive by social services so that wages can decrease even further because workers compete for jobs in order to survive. And even if there are environmental or labour regulations, because capitalism has become increasingly globalised, corporations can simply move their company to another country. And as a result, so many governments are having to decrease environmental and labour regulations because they fear that corporations will move to another country with more favourable conditions for doing business. And capitalists can use things like the threat to reduce employment, investment, or the ability to earn foreign exchange as powerful tools in battles over environmental concern. Worse still, many trade agreements allow foreign investors to sue governments if they put into place regulations that could be construed as interfering with their actual or prospective profit. The mere threat of a costly lawsuit could deter governments from implementing meaningful regulations to prevent environmental destruction. What I'm trying to argue is this type of wealth accumulation that Jeff Bezos has is based off of the exploitation of millions upon millions of people across the globe. There's nothing inherently just about any of this. So as we've seen, environmental destruction and labor exploitation is a fundamental part of the capitalist system. Simply giving $10 billion is working within the system. It's not challenging any of the root causes of the problem at all. When we examine the system really closely, we can see what Karl Marx said is correct. Other people's money is not justifiably theirs in the first place. Things like personal wealth, land, and power are accumulated in only one fundamental way: through the murdering, maiming, coercing, stealing, robbing, or exploiting of others. This type of wealth accumulation is inherently unjust because it's based off of the exploitation of millions and millions of people across the globe, and poverty and climate change cannot be solved by giving more and more donations because it doesn't challenge any of the system. It simply perpetuates it, it keeps it intact. So the root causes of the problem are never addressed. And Bezos is clearly a smart guy. I mean, at the very least, he has a wealth of experts, researchers, smart people all around him who he could access to gain more information about what would be the best way to address this issue. So he must be very aware that such a donation is really only going to prolong the problem rather than really address it. I mean, you could argue that, well, he's just trying to do a little bit to work within the system, do what he can. But I think if you take a step back and look at the bigger picture, his motivations appear to be far more sinister. Look at all the evidence. We can see that most billionaires approach this type of donation as a branding exercise. It's a way to maintain their reputation, to increase their profits, and a way to gain more political power whilst maintaining their positions within this unjust system. When faced with any type of scandal, corporations use something which is called corporate social responsibility, which is a vehicle through which corporations maintain their reputation and avoid any type of government regulations. And Bezos has more reason than most to worry about his reputation as a corporation. I mean, in the last few years, the very existence of billionaires has been called into question. It's been a key area of political debate, and many people say that should billionaires even exist is the defining question of 2019. Bernie Sanders, running for president, has made the moral condemnation of the billionaire class a key element of his presidential campaign, and led the public campaign to shame Bezos into raising Amazon workers' wages. Bezos has also come under scrutiny for paying very little to no taxes and pitting states in the US against each other to get huge subsidies to set up Amazon facilities. Not only this, but suspiciously, this announcement of Bezos' initiative came out one day before the premiere of the documentary that is investigating Amazon's practices. Amazon has also in recent years come under a great deal of scrutiny for its labor practices. To give just a brief idea, employees are pushed to meet extremely high targets, subjected to strict breaks and a terrifying work environment monitored electronically, and worried that not meeting their targets will result in immediately losing their jobs. Employees talk about peeing in bottles for fear of being disciplined. Amazon workers have been forced to work in 100-degree heat, with ambulances waiting outside, taking away the ones that fell. Through large-scale donations, exploitative labor practices and corporate scandals are pushed under the carpet as everyone's focusing on how amazing this donation is. These kind of donations are a relatively small price to pay for a lot of corporations who might otherwise have to change their operational practices. It just basically gives them a moral cover to continue to work in exploitative and environmentally damaging ways. And these type of donations might actually end up increasing their self-interest and their profit margins because it's shown that these type of donations have a positive effect on perceptions by stock market analysts. It also leads to a rise in the value of their assets a lot of the time, and it's particularly profitable if this pledge just ends up being bullshit and none of it is ever given at all, which often happens with many rich people where they pledge to give a lot of money to increase their reputation but never actually end up following through. These type of donations also help to give the rich political power because they begin to collaborate more with organizations, governments, politicians, civic bodies, and we have seen how the separation between the state and the government has continued to erode over the past few years as the richest CEOs or corporations are now quasi-politicians. This means that corporations like Amazon can gain huge amounts of economic and political power on a global scale. It also prevents the injustices of this global economic system that enables some people to become billionaires from becoming so apparent that its legitimacy would collapse. So we can see that all of this is just basic marketing, but if you're still very skeptical about everything that I've said, if we take a look at Amazon's pattern of donations, which Bezos' Earth Fund continues, we can see that Bezos consistently gives crumbs of his wealth in order to whitewash his environmental track record on other issues. For example, Amazon's $690,000 donation to Australian bushfire relief distracted attention from the company's relationship with Australia's largest oil and gas companies. Another interesting example is how it is reported that Jeff asked Mike Bloomberg if he would consider running for the presidential campaign. It's not confirmed why Jeff did this, but it's not hard to imagine that a man worth more than $100 billion wouldn't mind a new business-minded fellow billionaire presidential opponent to Sanders. Bezos clearly sees Bernie as a big threat to his profit margin, and maybe more importantly, Bezos should be actively supporting someone like Bernie if he really cared about climate change, since Bernie is the only presidential candidate that has any meaningful policies to do with climate change. There are so many other examples of Bezos' horrible track record on climate change. For example, when Bezos' employees staged a climate strike and called for Bezos to implement climate policies, Bezos responded by trying to silence them, intimidating his employees, threatening to fire a few members, and even changed his communications policy so that people can no longer publicly identify as Amazon employees and say anything related to Amazon's business without prior PR approval. This change was made explicitly to prevent Amazon employees from speaking out about the public information about Amazon's hideous track record on climate change. Bezos' Earth Fund also made absolutely no mention of his company's own impact on climate change. Despite the huge carbon footprint of the vast network of delivery trucks, Amazon Web Services, the cloud computing division, which work with oil and gas companies, designed to help them better extract fossil fuels and squeeze more profit from the industry. Amazon also funds climate-denying think tanks like the Competitive Enterprise Institute and Climate Delaying Policy. It wasn't until 2019, after almost a year of pressure from employees, that Amazon finally released a report on the company's impact on the environment. It found that in 2018, Amazon emitted 44.4 million tons of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, equivalent to the emissions of the whole of Norway. One hand can't give what another one is taking. He is giving us pennies in order for him to be able to continue business as usual, make a profit, and continue to gain more and more economic and political power. A lot of people say, well, okay, Bezos has done some terrible things and perhaps he has some ulterior motives, but isn't this better than nothing at all? Shouldn't we be happy that we're getting something? But if we look at the research surrounding philanthropy, it actually suggests that a lot of these type of donations end up harming rather than helping. First of all, when organizations are receiving money from rich elites like Bezos, they might end up adopting strategies and policies and practices that aren't challenging any of the root problems of climate change, that are incompatible with what is actually needed to solve climate change because they have to cater to the wishes of the rich billionaire funding them and want to continue receiving money from him. They aren't going to address the capitalist system or address the social and environmental impact of corporations or bring politics into the picture as they otherwise might have because they want to continue to receive funding, so they're not going to challenge the economic and political power of the person that is funding them. Basically, they have to completely ignore the root causes of the problem altogether. These organizations also de-radicalize and remove key figures from social justice movements by employing and absorbing the most passionate and effective activists that would otherwise be challenging the status quo and creating meaningful change, as social justice comes to be viewed as a salaried activity. Often, this salaried activity involves preoccupation with writing grant proposals, bureaucracy, and obtaining funding, robbing them of the time they would otherwise have spent on more radical causes. By partially meeting the needs of those suffering from it, these donations can also prevent people organizing and revolting. In this way, this type of donation can be used as a way to control and monitor social movements, and the reduction in political agitation can reduce the likelihood of them forming a movement for systemic change that could create wide-ranging solutions. At the same time, it gives the general public the impression that we have the environmental problem under control. It completely obscures the problem, it blunts the edges of political resistance, and prevents meaningful systemic change. There are also a lot of racist, paternalistic tropes associated with these types of philanthropy, which I won't go into more here because I discussed it in greater detail on my video on volunteerism, which I'll link below for anyone that's interested. I'm also incredibly suspicious about the types of things that Jeff is going to be donating to. If it's for research and scientists, it might do what corporations like Monsanto have done for years, funding papers on their own practices with huge conflicts of interests to propel people to continue to support their work. Or Jeff may fund highly problematic geoengineering or carbon capture technologies, which again make the problem of capitalism a technical one that can be solved through technical solutions, further depoliticizing the conversation and giving us the impression that the environmental problem is under control. Large-scale donations that the media then sensationalizes also gives us, as the general public, a skewed idea of how to create change. If all that the richest man and one of the most powerful men in the world can do for the climate is to give donations, is to give money, then what can the rest of us do? We naturally assume that the only power we have is the power of our money. The rich and the powerful have vested interest in maintaining this narrative within the general public that the only way to create change is through powerful individuals or through donating our money, because once again it blunts the edges of political resistance or collective action. It also sets up a moral hierarchy between giver and receiver. We are taught to think of ourselves as so good and kind for donating, which then distracts from the fact that the donations help maintain a system that immiserates a large majority of the world's population. It makes us think that donations are a matter of personal discretion rather than moral responsibility. There's also a lot of psychological research that shows that a focus on donating money tends to increase individualism and reduce communal motivation and hinder engagement in political movements. People tend to donate and feel satisfied and are then unlikely to devote any further effort to think about the problem or think about the real causes. We should be encouraging direct action, collective action, developing and strengthening our voices for change, not getting a corporate job so that we have a lot of money to be able to donate. Obviously, I don't think that all types of donations on all types of charitable organizations are inherently useless or unhelpful or bad. In fact, I regularly try to donate to political organizations. I think that that is incredibly important, and I definitely don't advocate making conditions worse for people, as I don't think that's a great strategy for creating social change. But we have to see the system for what it is. Philanthropic donations like the one made by Bezos simply obscures the rot at the center of the system and the nature of the problem from those that are suffering it. It gets us to not only make peace with the system, but to actively perpetuate and embrace it. And even if you believe that Bezos' money will actually do so much good for climate change or for people in general, then that should be even more reason to oppose billionaires and oppose the capitalist system in general. Even if this donation has a huge impact on the climate, why should we be relying on the voluntary donation of one single individual to get to decide whether or not we save the climate? One single individual should not get to decide whether our children's children have water and food and resources and a planet to live on. No matter how you look at this, none of this is just in any way, and we need to change this system. The rich and powerful in this world have vested interest in keeping us as ignorant as possible. We have to remove the veil from around our eyes and see the system for what it is. There is no superhero billionaire that's coming to save us from the villain that he benefits from. We have to work collectively to be able to save ourselves. You don't just make billions of dollars, you take billions of dollars, you plunder it from the environment, you take it from the lives of millions upon millions of people across the globe that could be saved if you just redistributed your wealth. You take it from the labor of people who are working for you under exploitative, horrible conditions. You take it from the lives of all the people who are going to not be able to have a planet to live on. Why on earth should we be grateful for the crumbs that fall from the rich man's table? And maybe people are right that this will have a positive impact on the climate and on the planet as a whole. But I believe the main thing that this will do is what I think Jeff Bezos' intentions were, which is to obscure the nature of the problem of climate change, to blunt the edges of political resistance, and to get us to ignore the systemic root causes of climate change, get us to not challenge the system in any way, whilst at the same time increasing his profit margins and increasing his political power. We must recognize the system for what it is. We must recognize the root causes of this type of wealth accumulation and of climate change, and we have to work collectively to be able to dismantle it and build a different type of system that isn't inherently based off of the exploitation of humanity and of the destruction of the environment. We have to unionize, collectivize, work together to create change in any way we can. Get involved in any type of anti-capitalist organizations that you can. Get involved in your community. Spread this information as much as you can. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to me and getting all the way to the end of this video, and I would really appreciate if anyone would consider becoming a Patreon so that I can continue to make videos and continue to upgrade equipment and improve the quality and quantity of this content. And I want to say a huge shout out to my great friend James, who has a YouTube channel called James Finley, as well as books and poems and other types of art, because he has edited this video and done such a good job.